Mark Wahlberg pushed through the revolving door of ABC News at exactly 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes early as always. At 52, he moved with the confident stride of a man who had conquered his demons and built an empire on discipline. Today felt good. His new film, Second Chances, was getting strong reviews, giving him another platform to discuss his work with at-risk youth. The 23rd floor bustled with Sunday morning television chaos. His publicist, Jennifer Martinez, materialized beside him, her designer suit perfectly pressed despite the early hour. But Mark caught the subtle tension in her shoulders. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Everything looks good, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. George's team has assured us this will focus on the film and your youth programs. Jennifer, Mark said, studying her face. What's going on? You look like someone just told you the Titanic hit an iceberg. Before she could answer, George Stephanopoulos approached with his signature blend of warmth and gravitas. Mark, good to see you again. The handshake lasted exactly the right amount of time, but Mark noticed something in George's eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there at their charity gala 6 months earlier. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Your work with the youth programs is really remarkable. George's tone was cordial, but underneath lay a formality that felt rehearsed. I think our viewers will find it very illuminating. The word hung in the air too long. Mark's instincts began to prickle. As they walked toward the studio, Mark noticed the crew's behavior. Camera operators exchanged glances that lasted a beat too long. The floor director watched them approach with the expression of someone bracing for impact. 30 seconds, the floor director called out. George settled into his chair with practiced ease. When he looked up, his expression had shifted completely. Gone was the genial host. In his place sat a journalist, eyes sharp with purpose. And we're live in 5, 4, 3. Good morning, I'm George Stephanopoulos, and this is This Week. With me now is Academy Award-nominated actor Mark Wahlberg, whose new film, Second Chances, opens nationwide this Friday. Thanks for having me, George. Always a pleasure. Your new film deals with themes of redemption and second chances, George continued, his tone carrying an undertone that made Mark's alarm system buzz. But I have to ask, don't you think there's something inherently hypocritical about a man with your past positioning himself as a mentor to vulnerable young people? The question hit like a slap, not because Mark hadn't heard variations before, but because of how George delivered it, not as genuine inquiry, but as accusation wrapped in journalistic language. I don't think it's hypocritical at all, George, Mark replied, his voice measured but carrying a new edge. I think it makes me uniquely qualified. These kids need someone who's been where they are. George leaned forward, sensing weakness. But surely you can understand why some people might question whether your philanthropic efforts are genuine attempts to help or simply very public penance designed to rehabilitate your image. Mark felt his composure crack slightly. George, I've been doing this work for over 15 years. The kids I work with aren't props in some image campaign. They're real people with real problems. Of course, but when we're talking about someone with your particular history, violent incidents, legal troubles, allegations that go beyond simple youthful indiscretion, don't you think parents have a right to question your involvement? What allegations?
Mark asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. If you've got something specific to say, then say it. George's smile remained professional, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. The question isn't whether you've changed. Most people would agree you have. The question is whether that change is enough to erase what came before. Erase what came before? Mark's Boston accent thickened, as it always did when he was angry. There's a difference between acknowledging your past and having it weaponized against you every time you try to do something positive. George rifled through his index cards with theatrical deliberation. Let's talk about facts, then. Isn't it fair to say that these efforts serve a dual purpose? On one hand, they may help young people. On the other hand, they function as very expensive, very public celebrity penance, a way to buy redemption for past actions. Celebrity penance? Mark's voice dropped to dangerous quiet. I spent more than half my life trying to make up for mistakes I made when I was 16. I've given millions of dollars, thousands of hours, and opened my heart to kids who needed someone to believe in them. And you want to reduce all of that to a public relations stunt? George remained unmoved. When someone's past includes the kind of incidents that yours does, it's natural to question whether charitable work is motivated by genuine compassion or by a desire to control the narrative. Mark stood abruptly, then forced himself to sit back down. The damage was done. George had witnessed the crack in his armor. "Why don't you spell that out for the folks at home, George? Instead of dancing around with vague insinuations, why don't you tell everyone exactly what you're accusing me of?" "I'm simply noting that your charitable work began around the same time that certain incidents became public knowledge. The timing is interesting." Mark felt his self-control slipping. This was exactly what George wanted, the explosive reaction that would dominate news cycles. "When you speak to these young people about making better choices," George continued, "do you tell them about the victims of your poor choices? Do you explain that actions have consequences extending far beyond the person committing them?" The accusation was breathtakingly cynical. Mark stared at George with disbelief, unable to comprehend how someone could reduce decades of genuine effort to a public relations strategy. The studio fell into uncomfortable silence. The crew exchanged glances of professional discomfort. Mark's publicist had abandoned all composure, speaking rapidly into her phone about the Category 5 disaster unfolding. But Mark's focus concentrated entirely on George Stephanopoulos, this man who sat with smug confidence, believing he held all the cards. The rage in Mark's chest was building, but underneath was something more dangerous. Cold, clear understanding that George had miscalculated. He thought he was attacking a celebrity desperate to protect his image. Instead, he had provoked a street fighter from Dorchester. "You know what I think is self-serving, George?" Mark said quietly, his voice carrying a new edge. "I think what's self-serving is a journalist who uses his platform to destroy people instead of informing the public. Someone who hides behind asking tough questions when he's really conducting character assassination." For the first time, George's perfect composure flickered, a brief flash of uncertainty, recognition that perhaps he had underestimated his guest. The battle was far from over, but the rules had just changed, and Mark Wahlberg was no longer playing defense. George straightened in his chair, recognizing the shift in Mark's demeanor, but pressing forward with the relentless instinct of a veteran interrogator who smelled blood in the water. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, casting sharper shadows across both men's faces. "Let me be more direct, then," George said, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor addressing a hostile witness. "Your victims, the people you assaulted as a teenager, do you think they received real justice? Do you think a few months in juvenile detention was adequate compensation for the trauma you inflicted?" The accusation landed like a physical blow. Mark's jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle jumped visibly beneath his skin. His hands, which had been resting casually on the chair arms, slowly curled into fists. "Real justice?" Mark repeated, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying enough edge to cut glass. "What exactly do you think real justice looks like, George? Because I've spent 30 years trying to figure that out." "I think," George replied with calculated coolness, "that real justice might involve more than charitable donations and feel-good photo opportunities. Some might argue that true accountability requires facing consequences proportional to the harm caused." The studio fell into a hush so complete that the soft hum of the air conditioning became audible. Even the crew, trained to remain invisible during filming, found themselves holding their breath as they witnessed something unprecedented, a celebrity interview transforming into a public reckoning. Mark's composure, so carefully maintained through decades of media training, began to fracture like ice under pressure. His voice, when he spoke, carried a tremor that wasn't fear, but barely contained rage mixed with something deeper, a guilt that had never fully healed despite all his efforts at redemption. "Proportional consequences?" he said, his Boston accent thickening with emotion. "You want to talk about proportional consequences? I've been paying for those mistakes every single day for 30 years. Every time someone like you drags it up, every time I have to watch my kids hear about it, every time I wonder if the good I'm trying to do even matters." Jennifer, his publicist, had moved to the very edge of the set now, her face pale with panic. She was making frantic cutting gestures with her hand, trying to catch the eye of anyone in the production booth who might have the authority to end this disaster before it spiraled completely out of control. But George's eyes had taken on the predatory gleam of someone who had found his target's weakness and intended to exploit it fully. George leaned forward, sensing the kill. His voice dropped to a more intimate register, the tone of someone about to reveal a devastating secret. "Mark, let's talk about the elephant in the room that nobody wants to address. The racially motivated attacks, the harassment of Vietnamese immigrants, the hate crimes that went far beyond teenage rebellion." The words hit Mark like a physical assault. His face underwent a transformation that was visible to everyone in the studio, disbelief morphing into hurt, then crystallizing into pure, incandescent rage. The color drained from his cheeks, then returned as a flush of anger that spread up his neck. "What?" Mark's voice came out as a croak, then strengthened into something dangerous. "What did you just say?" "The incidents in Dorchester," George pressed, his tone now clinical, surgical. "The documented cases of racial harassment. Surely you're not going to deny—" "Stop!" Mark's voice cut through the studio like a blade. He half rose from his chair, his body coiled with tension. "Stop right there. You want to make accusations like that, you better have some proof to back them up. Because what you're suggesting, what you're implying, that's not journalism. That's character assassination." For the first time since the interview began, George's composure wavered. He glanced down at his index cards, shuffling them with less confidence. "The police reports from that period clearly indicate—" "Show me." Mark's voice was steel now, all pretense of media-trained politeness abandoned. "Show me these police reports. Show me this documentation. Because I think what you're doing right now is throwing around inflammatory accusations, hoping something will stick." The camera operators exchanged alarmed glances. One of them actually took a step backward, as if the tension in the room had become a physical force. The floor director was making increasingly frantic gestures toward the control booth. George's mask slipped further. "Well, the specific details aren't—" "The specific details aren't what, George?" Mark stood fully now, towering over the seated journalist. "Aren't available, aren't verified, or aren't true." His voice carried the authority of a man who had just realized his opponent was fighting with blanks. "Because if you're going to sit there and essentially call me a racist on national television, you better have more than documented cases and vague implications." The hunter had just become the hunted. George's face had gone pale, his professional mask cracking like cheap plaster. He fumbled with his index cards, suddenly looking like a student called on without having done the homework. "The incidents are well documented in various—" "Various what?" Mark cut him off, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Various tabloid articles, various unnamed sources, because that's not documentation, George. That's gossip dressed up as journalism." Mark took a step closer to George's chair, his physical presence suddenly dominating the intimate studio space. The camera operators instinctively adjusted their angles, sensing they were capturing something unprecedented. "You want to talk about credibility?"
Mark's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about those undisclosed donations you made to political campaigns while you were supposed to be providing objective news coverage. Let's talk about how you've turned journalism into entertainment, ratings over truth." George's composure crumbled further. For the first time, his hands visibly trembled as he reached for his water glass. "I don't think personal attacks are appropriate." "Personal attacks?" Mark's laugh was sharp and humorless. "That's rich, coming from someone who just spent 10 minutes trying to destroy my reputation with unsubstantiated allegations. What's the matter, George? Don't like it when the spotlight gets turned around?" The crew had gone completely silent, recognizing they were witnessing a complete reversal of power. Jennifer, Mark's publicist, had stopped making cutting gestures and was now staring in fascination and horror. "The difference between us," Mark continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, is that when I made mistakes, I owned them, I paid for them, I changed. But you? You hide behind that anchor desk pretending to be some moral authority while you peddle gossip and call it news. So before you start questioning my integrity, maybe you should take a long, hard look at your own. George leaned back in his chair, no longer the predator, but clearly the prey. George tried to regain his footing, his journalist's instincts kicking in despite his rattled state. Now hold on, Mark. I'm asking the tough questions that the public deserves answers to. That's my job. Your job? Mark's voice rose, abandoning all pretense of television civility. Your job is supposed to be informing people, not destroying them for ratings. When's the last time you actually broke a real story instead of just stirring up controversy? I resent the implication, George began, but Mark cut him off with a sharp gesture. You resent it? You spent the last 15 minutes trying to paint me as some unreformed criminal, and you resent my implication? Mark's voice cracked like a whip. Let me tell you what I resent, George. I resent parasites who make their living off other people's pain. The floor director was now openly signaling to the control booth, drawing his finger across his throat in the universal gesture to cut the feed. Camera operators looked between each other uncertainly, unsure whether to keep rolling or shut down. George's face flushed red. I have been a journalist for over 30 years. And what do you have to show for it? Mark interrupted, his voice rising to match George's. A career built on gotcha moments and manufactured outrage? You want to talk about accountability? How about you account for the damage you've done to public discourse? I won't be lectured by someone who actually changed, Mark leaned forward aggressively, by someone who took responsibility instead of hiding behind a microphone. The studio erupted into chaos as both men spoke over each other, their voices climbing toward a crescendo that would define television history. George's face was now flushed crimson, his composure completely shattered. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he played what he thought was his trump card, his voice rising above Mark's in a declaration that would haunt his career. The bottom line is this, George shouted, his professional mask finally torn away completely. Your past, the violence, the hate, the pattern of behavior is more troubling than anything we've discussed here today. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The studio fell into absolute silence, so complete that the soft whir of the cameras seemed deafening. Even the crew, trained to remain invisible during the most dramatic moments, froze in place. Mark's face underwent a transformation that was visible to millions of viewers. The flush of anger drained away, replaced by something far more dangerous, a cold, crystalline fury that seemed to radiate outward from him like heat from a forge. You can't say that, Mark said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but carrying such menace that everyone in the studio took an unconscious step backward. I just did, George replied, but his voice cracked on the words, betraying the bravado he was trying to project. Mark stood slowly, his movement deliberate and predatory. No, George, you can't say that, because you don't know what the hell you're talking about. You spent this entire interview throwing around accusations without facts, implications without evidence, and now you want to sit there and declare that my past, my mistakes, my growth, my redemption is somehow more troubling than your complete abandonment of journalistic integrity?
The camera operators were now visibly backing away from their equipment, sensing they were witnessing something that had crossed from television into genuine confrontation. You want to know what's troubling? Mark continued, his voice gaining power with each word. What's troubling is a so-called journalist who destroys lives for ratings. What's troubling is someone who hides behind a desk and throws stones at people who've actually tried to make amends for their mistakes. What's troubling is you, George. The studio had become a battlefield, and Mark Wahlberg was claiming victory. Mark straightened to his full height, his presence now commanding the entire studio. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had reclaimed control not just of the conversation, but of his own narrative. You want to know what real journalism looks like, George? It looks like seeking truth, not manufacturing controversy. It looks like giving people information they need to make informed decisions, not feeding them sensationalized garbage designed to boost ratings. George sat frozen in his chair, no longer the confident inquisitor, but a diminished figure who had overplayed his hand catastrophically. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. "And you want to know what real redemption looks like?" Mark continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It's not about erasing the past. It's about learning from it. It's about using your mistakes to help others avoid making the same ones. It's about showing up every single day and trying to be better than you were yesterday." He took a step toward his chair, but instead of sitting back down, he reached for his jacket. The gesture sent a ripple of shock through the studio. No guest had ever walked out on George Stephanopoulos during a live interview. "This isn't journalism, George. This is a hit job, and I'm not going to sit here and let you turn my life's work, the real lives of the kids I've helped, into your cheap entertainment." Mark slipped his arms into his leather jacket with deliberate calm, the motion somehow more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. "The difference between you and me," Mark said, looking directly into the camera instead of George, "is that I've actually tried to make amends for my mistakes. You just profit from other people's pain and call it news." He turned toward the studio exit, his movement decisive and final. Jennifer, his publicist, scrambled to collect her things, her face a mixture of panic and admiration. "This interview is over," Mark declared, his voice carrying across the stunned silence of the studio. "I've got real work to do." The camera caught him in profile as he walked away, leaving George Stephanopoulos alone at the anchor desk, exposed and diminished before millions of viewers. The studio door closed behind Mark with a soft click that seemed to echo like a gunshot. George sat frozen at the anchor desk, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The red light on the cameras continued blinking, a merciless reminder that millions of viewers were witnessing his complete professional dismantling. We'll be right back," George stammered, his voice barely audible as he stared into the camera with the hollow expression of a man who had just watched his career implode in real time. The floor director frantically signaled for a commercial break, but the damage was already spreading beyond the studio walls like wildfire. In living rooms across America, viewers sat stunned by what they had just witnessed. Social media erupted instantaneously, hashtags trending within minutes, clips being shared and reshared, the nation dividing along predictable lines. Some praised Mark for his courage in confronting what they saw as journalistic bullying. Others condemned him for his explosive temper and dramatic exit. But everyone agreed on one thing: they had never seen anything like it on live television. In the hallway outside the studio, Jennifer caught up with Mark, her heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor. "Mark, we need to—" "No," he said quietly, not breaking stride. "We don't need to do anything. What happened in there speaks for itself." Behind them, through the studio's glass walls, they could see George still sitting at the anchor desk, looking somehow smaller, diminished. The crew moved around him with the careful efficiency of people trying to salvage a disaster, but their glances spoke volumes about what they had witnessed. Mark paused at the elevator, his hand on the call button. For a moment, his shoulders sagged with the weight of what had just transpired. The fight for redemption, he realized, would never truly end. There would always be another George, another ambush, another test of whether his past would define his future. But today, at least, he had refused to be a victim. The elevator doors opened and Mark stepped inside, leaving behind a studio forever changed and a journalist who would never recover from underestimating a street fighter from Dorchester. The question that would dominate news cycles for weeks remained unanswered. In this battle between past and present, between accountability and redemption, who had truly won? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.